March 24th, 1976. Buenos Aires, Argentina. A military junta deposed the country's elected president and set up a dictatorship only 2 years before they were set to host the 1978 FIFA World Cup. The year comes around and the event takes place, with FIFA's president sitting next to the country's dictator as countless decisions inexplicably go in the host nation's favor. Argentina go on to lift the World Cup on home soil, with their celebrations taking place only a short distance away from a prison complex where political prisoners are being detained, tortured, and killed. December 2nd, 2010. The FIFA Executive Committee convenes to determine the host nation of 2 future World Cups in a single conference for the first time in its history. Russia wins the 2018 hosting rights, and to the shock of unsuspecting onlookers, Qatar seals its status as the host for 2022. The United States, competing to host one of those World Cups, is incensed by the results and dispatches the FBI to investigate the matter. What they would go on to uncover in the years that followed was a web of racketeering, fraud, and money laundering spanning back decades that would threaten to not only discredit FIFA as an organization, but to topple its entire leadership structure. FIFA, as football's governing body, is an international organ with a powerful role in the world. It has more member nations than the UN, it's a profit-generating machine, and it's responsible for organizing the world's most popular sporting event every 4 years. What ended up being uncovered as investigations took place into the vote to grant Qatar the World Cup was a history of controversy that spanned almost a century, tying it to dictatorial regimes, untold amounts of unaccounted for money, and wrongdoing at every level. This is the story of how FIFA came to be, how it grew into the role it has today, and the controversies and shady dealings that have surrounded it since it first took shape. As football's popularity grew around the world in the early 20th century, the need to standardize rules and have international coordination became apparent, which led to the formation of the International Federation of Association Football, better known as FIFA, in France in 1904. It was established under the mandate of becoming the global umbrella for all footballing activities across the world. They initially had a problem with legitimacy, as many countries refused to come under their authority, including leading names in the sport at the time, such as England and many South American nations. As time progressed though, even early on, the power and stature of FIFA as an organization rose, and new members began opting in. Inspired by the Olympic Games, they decided to make their own tournament, with the very first World Cup to be played in 1930. By 1932, they had moved their headquarters from France to Switzerland, but it was 1934 that marked the point at which this story began its controversial turn, with Mussolini's Italy as the stage to host the second ever tournament. It's a classic tool in the dictatorial playbook to use sporting events to promote authoritarian regimes. Both Hitler and Mussolini used the Olympics and the World Cup respectively in the 1930s as propaganda instruments for their states. Next to nothing about this World Cup was legitimate or uncontroversial. There were widespread accusations of Mussolini being involved in handpicking Italy's referees and ensuring that they were favorable towards them, leading to major suspicions of bribery and corruption. It was the first true accusations of match fixing that FIFA had faced, and even if it wasn't to be the last, it was still the most blatant one to this day. Italy went on to leave the majority of the other teams they played complaining about decisions going against them on their way to winning it, as Mussolini watched on. Another World Cup was organized before the Second World War put a pause to the procedures, but it picked up again in 1950 and continued to be hosted every 4 years after that. With each passing edition, the game was gaining traction, visibility, and popularity around the world. As more people started having access to televisions and the game's stature continued to grow, FIFA's profits and the money in football more widely slowly followed suit. What was originally a slow and steady rise in revenue, influence, and the potential for corruption would soon go on to explode though. This potential would be fully realized under the leadership of one man who would change the trajectory of football forever. João Havelange was a former Brazilian Olympian who ran for the FIFA presidency in 1974, campaigning alongside and supported by the legendary status of Pelé. Havelange's election marked a pivotal moment in FIFA's history in many ways. As the first, and to this day only, non-European president, he symbolized the sport's global expansion. He was also the first to not only realize but to actualize the organization's money-making potential, being widely recognized as the one who opened up football to capitalism. The first World Cup he was involved in was that infamous 1978 World Cup in Argentina that we started the video with. He was the man who stood next to Jorge Videla, Argentina's dictator, as they won their first title on home soil. As with Italy's 1934 World Cup, but now under global scrutiny, corruption was clearly present throughout to favor Argentina. The hosts benefited from strategic scheduling, biased refereeing, and even alleged match fixing, notably including a suspicious 6-0 win over Peru. Ultimately, Argentina's victory became a propaganda coup for the military junta. As much as fans love to call out match fixing when things don't go their way, this was the last of the blatantly obvious collusions to see a team crowned champions. The corruption that has taken place since has taken on a different nature. The son of Adi Dassler, the founder of Adidas, was called Horst Dassler, and he established a company called International Sport and Leisure, ISL. This firm would take over the marketing responsibilities and broadcasting rights of many major sporting events. He had the World Cup on his sights, and Havelange was more than happy to play ball, collecting a large personal payout for himself as ISL took on a monopoly of FIFA's marketing and broadcasting rights. Up to this point, FIFA's profits had grown steadily with every tournament, but as the 1980s came around, the growth became exponential. That's the point where sponsorships, merchandise, and TV rights started growing in value, and FIFA was raking in multiple millions of dollars. At this time, all of this money was controlled by 24 officials, namely the leaders of each confederation and some senior officials like the president. This group was FIFA's executive committee, better known as EXCO. They had the power to distribute the earnings to member countries for building football fields, holding tournaments, and establishing youth programs. There was no official organ to oversee where the money was actually going though, and this is where there were first signs of money going missing. During Havelange's time in charge, FIFA had grown to become an empire, with him as the emperor. He would continue taking payments from ISL off the record, until one day, a payment intended for his personal account was mistakenly deposited into a FIFA corporate account. Something this blatant had the potential to spill over into a scandal, so he was convinced to step down by resigning before it got messy. While it was him that laid the groundwork for FIFA's evolution into a financial powerhouse, it was his protege that would take the organization's finances, influence, and scope for corruption to a whole new level. On the 8th of June 1998, Sepp Blatter was elected as FIFA's new president, where he would reign for 17 years before being exposed for playing a leading role in the largest corruption scandal in sporting history. Blatter had stepped into the position of emperor, but the two men were fundamentally different. While Havelange was more of a case of a classic corrupt official who took bribes and wanted to enrich himself, Blatter was seemingly more interested in power. He allowed the growing corruption within different levels of the organization to continue because he relied on their support to keep himself in power. ISL, FIFA's marketing partner since the 1980s, had been crucial in transforming the World Cup into a multi-billion-dollar event. Its collapse in 2001, with $300 million in debt, not only threatened FIFA financially, but exposed the organization's risky business practices. Despite facing accusations of financial mismanagement and abuse of power, Blatter's political savvy allowed him to not only survive the ISL scandal, but secure re-election in 2002. FIFA as an institution had grown alongside the sport it represented. It had more member states than the United Nations. The world's most popular video game was named after it. The hosting of the World Cup was seen as a way to not just bring prestige and potential billions in tourism money to a country, but also to provide recognition to its leadership and a potential avenue towards nation building for some. FIFA and its executives knew that they had big power over the sporting world and even entire governments. By the end of the 2000s, it was common knowledge that many of them were accepting bribes from companies and governments in shady dealings to determine their votes. The first World Cup voting process that started coming into the spotlight was Germany in 2006. It was the most competitive bidding process in history, and at that time, some people were already seeing where things were going. Investigative journalist Andrew Jennings wrote a book that year titled Foul: The Secret World of FIFA, which went into all sorts of dirty deals and corruption within FIFA's structure at the time. It later came out that Germany had bribed at least 4 ExCo members for their votes, which was the first publicly reported incident that revealed FIFA members cutting deals under the table to settle on their vote. The same thing would go on to happen for the 2010 South Africa World Cup. At this point, it started to become well known that countries bidding had to essentially bribe their way to receiving host status. But what wasn't widespread knowledge was that it was this way by design. The countries that would win the rights to host weren't the ones with the best infrastructure, tradition in the game, or rational reasons for winning. It was the ones that could put the most money into all levels of FIFA's system. FIFA had created a voting process over the years that would be won by countries with the most cash to line officials' pockets with and the least internal accountability to see where it was going. In the 2000s, people didn't look into this too seriously, and it seemed like it was just a few rotten apples in the bunch. By the time it was 2010 and the next World Cups were set to have their bidding process, Blatter's reign seemed unshakable. But the very system of corruption that he had nurtured would ultimately lead to FIFA's most damaging crisis. World Cup host voting had historically been done with one World Cup at a time, allowing countries and members to deal with each vote individually. The unprecedented decision to award 2 World Cups in 2010 raised a lot of eyebrows before voting even started. While officially touted as a way to provide longer planning time for hosts, critics saw it as an opportunity for FIFA officials to maximize personal gain from the bidding process and double their profits upfront by selling broadcasting rights. This was particularly ideal for a generation of ExCo members who were growing old and knew that this could be their last big payday before they retired. Many of these men had been accused of abusing their power before, but this was the moment where they took it a step too far.
Ladies and gentlemen, I do hope that the name of the winner is on both sides, because I don't know. So the 2018 FIFA World Cup, 2018 FIFA World Cup, ladies and gentlemen, will be organized in Russia. The winner to organize the 2022 FIFA World Cup is Qatar.
The selections of Russia for 2018 and Qatar for 2022 were a shock to many, and what followed was a whirlwind of investigations that would peel back the layers of decades-long corruption within the organization. Many members of the teams from bidding nations weren't surprised considering how they had been asked for many favors from delegates. One FIFA representative reportedly even asked the English bidding team for a reception with the late Queen and a knighthood in exchange for their vote. The outcome of these votes was a series of investigations that would bring the organization to its knees. The US Department of Justice took the lead, launching a criminal investigation that culminated in a 163-page report in May 2015, as whistleblowers were coming out with information and FIFA even commissioned an internal investigation. These would uncover not just the corruption related to these 2 bids, but to the historic trends that the organization had taken part in for decades. Russia and Qatar's advantages went beyond their wealth. They were the only 2 authoritarian countries in the contest for either voting process, so they were freer to work the shadier side of the bid and spend however much was needed to win the favor of the decision makers. Russia was a dubious decision. While speculators assumed that oil and gas money was somehow involved, they at least had some kind of history and tradition in the game. The real problem was when Qatar, a country who had never qualified for the World Cup, had no real history of football and had been deemed as an unsuitable host by official FIFA documents prior to the vote, was selected. Several problems had already been identified before the vote even took place, including its complete lack of infrastructure and the country's extreme summer heat. In 2012, US Attorney Michael Garcia was hired by FIFA to write a report on the numerous allegations of bribery and corruption surrounding the Qatar choice. He spent 2 years building a case against FIFA, which laid everything out. But instead of FIFA releasing the full report when it was finished in 2014, they released a summary, completely misrepresenting what the report actually said and highlighting corruption from England and the US rather than from the winning bids. Garcia promptly resigned after seeing years of work being completely misrepresented. But as much as FIFA tried to brush things under the carpet, they wouldn't be able to keep things out of the spotlight for too much longer. The US Justice Department's investigation accused some officials of charges including fraud, racketeering, and money laundering. In a coordinated operation, Swiss police arrested 7 FIFA executives in Zurich in a single morning, with 7 more apprehended by the day's end. It was revealed that over $150 million had been paid in bribes to these officials. Over the decades, these executives had been lining their pockets, and they were finally exposed. 11 of these FIFA officials eventually went on to plead guilty, handing back tens of millions in fines. By this point in 2015 though, most of the evidence coming out wasn't even about the Qatar World Cup. It was all based on previous other scandals and bribes. It took until 2019 for people to realize how truly corrupt the Qatar World Cup was. Former UEFA president Michel Platini was arrested following a 2-year investigation into bribery in the Qatar World Cup bid, and the corruption went seriously deep, even including the French government, with the French president being actively involved. French and Qatari officials were deep in business at multiple levels, with Qatar buying up French assets like PSG during France's economic downturn, all in exchange for the French government to do what they could to get FIFA to vote for Qatar. Blatter didn't escape the charges, and only 4 days after being comfortably re-elected for a 5th term as FIFA president, he effectively resigned. He was found guilty of ethics violations and was banned from taking part in any football-related activities for 8 years, and later receiving a further 6-year ban. Both Blatter and Platini were cleared of charges 8 months later, but the damage to their reputations had already been done. In the wake of the scandal, FIFA attempted reforms. A new FIFA council replaced the executive committee, term limits were introduced, and a human rights policy was adopted. However, most critics argue that these changes were largely superficial, failing to address the root causes of corruption and maintaining the incentives that led to the corruption in the first place. What the investigations uncovered more than anything, though, was a history of corruption that took different forms. From match fixing at earlier tournaments and the siphoning of money away from the development funds for grassroots football in smaller nations, to an organizational structure that incentivized off-the-book payments to grant hosting rights, it was revealed that football's leading governing body was at its core a fundamentally corrupt organization. This systemic corruption didn't just affect the elite levels of sport, but reshaped the entire football landscape, from the building of local pitches, or lack thereof, to multi-million-dollar World Cup stadiums. As the dust settled on FIFA's biggest scandal, the football world was left to deal with its implications. The image of the organization that represented the beautiful game had been tarnished, but the full extent of the damage is something we're still yet to entirely understand. Despite the scandals and subsequent reforms, FIFA's fundamental challenges remain. The interplay between power, money, and football that the organization has been involved in has often led to controversy. Today, as the sport continues to evolve, these same forces still shape its future at different levels. As money continues to flow into the sport, driven by huge broadcasting deals and billionaires and nation-states buying up clubs, new challenges continue to pop up. FIFA and other governing bodies will be looked at for guidance to mitigate the potential corruption that could stem from this, but given their tarnished reputation, we could even see a shift away from them. It's also important to differentiate between corruption and sheer incompetence. And in a sport that looks as refined and polished as it ever has done, people don't tend to realize that it's ultimately humans making the refereeing decisions, and some of these guys just aren't good enough. In World Cups in particular, there are countless cases of countries feeling hard done by. The thing to note here is that most host nations historically have done relatively well, and refereeing decisions, conscious or unconscious, tend to play a part in that. Whether it was England being favoured in 1966 or Germany in 1974 to win them at home, the blatant match fixing of Italy in 1934 or Argentina in 1978, or even South Korea's run to the semi-finals in 2002, where inexplicable refereeing decisions were given in their favour in games against both Spain and Italy, including sending off opposition players and chalking off perfectly legitimate goals, host nations historically have been favoured by referees and done well at times irrespective of that. The recent awarding of the 2034 World Cup to Saudi Arabia has once again raised questions about the bid process and FIFA's commitments to human rights. As football moves forward, the sport finds itself at a crossroad. Can FIFA truly reform itself to prioritize the integrity of the game over personal financial gain for its members? Will new leadership emerge to challenge the status quo? Or will challengers from the outside step in to shake up the sport's entire governing structure? It could be that the fallout from this scandal could serve to completely reshape the organization and the direction it goes in. It could also be that 10 years from now, other creators are making videos on the corruption behind that and how FIFA changed the people in charge, but the structure ultimately stayed the same, leading to another round of controversy and a further discrediting of the organization. What comes out from that in the future, only time will tell. If you enjoyed this deep dive about FIFA, you might also enjoy this video we made on the channel about Chelsea's owners and how they took a club that spent 2 decades building a dynasty and collapsed it in a single year. If you haven't already, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep up with our next videos. We're still just getting started and there's a whole lot more to come. I'll see you next time.